chapter on AI, and this survey continues that. And the issues are with respect to the following that this chapter covers: the data center resource consumption, whether it is power or water or land, the kind of financial requirements for the large language models in the current ecosystem in the Western world, and data localization for domestic value creation. Of course, the macro question of mitigating the labor market impact, navigating geopolitical constraints to hardware access, including chips, and importantly, from a geopolitical security and dependability perspective, can we continue to depend on foreign models for use in public administration and critical sectors? Of course, the government is already making its position very clear. We are going to be looking at developing local models, which are underway actually, and some of it may be rolled out in the course of the AI summit next month. But these are the various trade-offs that this chapter 14 tackles. Now, this is another issue which we have been flagging in the last few economic surveys. India is committed to net zero by 2070. And India is one of the better performing countries in terms of installation of solar and wind power in the world. At the same time, if we have to become more pervasive as a share of overall energy generation, if renewable energy were to become a significant part of the energy picture, we need to understand the ramifications. The amount of material required and the energy required to therefore generate renewable energy should not be underestimated. We should go into it with open eyes, and that is what this screen shows you. It is self-explanatory. Therefore, this chapter, like in the previous occasions, does focus on adaptation, demand management, and also this time we are happy to share with you in chapter 10 the kind of environmental regulations that have been liberalized and made easier in terms of compliance, etc., compared to the past. And that is a very positive story that is also captured in chapter 10. The special essay this time is on urbanization, apart from the sequel to AI. In Indian cities, we face a multiplicity of challenges. One is the low floor space index and floor area ratio. Mobility is a challenge because last mile connectivity is still missing, although metro rail network has expanded significantly in the last 10 to 11 years. Solid waste management and waste disposal are still important issues with growing population and growing cities, and governance is dispersed among multiple agencies. But looking at this chapter, if you read it carefully, you will understand that getting urbanization right is not just, once again, as in the case of healthy food consumption or social media usage, is not just a matter of getting policy right. Citizens have an important role to play. We behave very differently in metro stations, and we behave very differently above the surface. And why is that the case? Why is it so? Our behavior in the metro is absolutely impeccable, but not so above the ground. So, why does it happen, and what can be done to make sure that there is no difference in the way citizens respond to metro rail as well as public transportation or road discipline? How is it possible, and what kind of behavioral dynamics are at work here, and how can the state facilitate and nudge the citizens to do so? These kinds of interesting issues are explored in chapter 15, along with a discussion of some specific experiments going on in different parts of the country, which actually point the way forward for the rest of the country as well. Now, moving on to part 3, I would like to compliment Business Standard for this wonderful line, which I use. India's growth story sits at the intersection of global headwinds and domestic potential. Exactly, well captured. So far, we have seen the domestic potential and priorities. We are going to now see the global headwinds. What is unfolding in the world today and why? If you look at the 5 bright pink boxes, this fund manager has predicted it in 2020 that the world will face populism, trade wars, financial repression, military conflicts, and negative real yields. And he doesn't trace this to specific personalities. He traces it to the kind of policies we adopted since the global financial crisis and the quantitative easing and ultra-low interest rate policy that was set in motion in 2008. So in other words, personalities are not the reason why the world is today looking at trade wars, military conflicts, and populism with negative real yields and financial repression to follow. These are products of choices that were made some 15 to 18 years ago, and therefore the train has already left the station with respect to these consequences, and they will be with us for the next 5 to 10 years as well. And that is something we need to take as given when we look at our own policy options and priorities. Therefore, geopolitical tensions are inevitable, and they have led to decadal level highs in global economic uncertainty. The uncertainty index reached historic highs when the reciprocal tariffs were announced, but still they are much higher compared to where they were at the turn of the millennium. And reflecting that is the price of gold, which goes up by more than $100 to $200 per ounce every day. So in other words, gold is not only responding to global uncertainty, but also the question marks arising with respect to the store of value of fiat currencies around the world. So therefore, what is going to become in this era of easy money? The problem is this era of easy money, which was there from 2008 onwards, which also resulted in high inflation in 2022 and 23, has resulted in a very expensive stock market, almost reaching the highs before the tech bubble burst in March 2000. Concentration risk even more than what we saw earlier in terms of few companies having a very high market cap, and financing of the global financial capital coming from non-banking sources rather than from banking sources which are better regulated. And if you look at the circular financing that characterizes many of the AI-related investments, you will understand that this can be a sort of a trigger to unravel the global finances. Therefore, we look at three possible scenarios for 2026 and maybe somewhere in 2027. It's very difficult to be precise about the timing. Scenario one, business as usual in 2025, continuing this year, but with less security and more fragility, and we attach a 40 to 45% probability to that. It is disorder, but managed disorder. Scenario two is a worse version of scenario one, and that will result in sharper trade-off for emerging economies, including India, between autonomy, growth, and stability, and supply chains will become even more politicized. Scenario three is the worst of them. It's a systemic shock cascade. Leverage AI infrastructure, which we spoke about earlier, will expose fragile business models. Financial, technological, and geopolitical shocks amplify each other and feed into each other. And this low probability but high impact outcome will have macro risks even exceeding those that we saw in the wake of 2008. This is the kind of world scenario that we are facing. Therefore, given this world scenario, but given our stellar domestic growth performance and prospects and priorities, how do we therefore prepare ourselves to drive our development Viksit Bharat agenda, and that is section 4. Why Swadeshi matters? Because the nature of the global system has changed. Trade is no longer reciprocal. Markets are no longer neutral, and supply chains have become instruments of state power, and we have seen them in several examples across the world. And therefore, Swadeshi is a legitimate policy instrument in such a world. Countries have to take care of their priorities, and therefore we should not be squeamish about swearing by Swadeshi in this kind of global environment. The conundrums, however, emerging markets face is this. There is going to be a resource crunch, which is reflected in the price of copper. And in the last 1 week, even crude oil prices have begun to firm. So we need to create buffers, whether it is fertilizer, base metals, crude oil, pharmaceutical ingredients. We need to have buffers because supply chains can be disrupted at any point in time, as we saw in the three global scenarios. And the other thing, apart from building up buffers, which we need to import in many cases, we also have to appreciate that as the economy grows, per capita income rises, imports will inevitably rise. This is a given. This chart here shows you China's per capita income growth going from nothing to $12,000 in the last 50 years or so. Simultaneously, imports have grown. We look at China as a major exporting power, that is true, but it also imports a lot, 3.3 trillion, including services. So similarly, India going from $2,500 per capita to $20,000 per capita in the next 25 years will also see its imports rise. Therefore, means we have to export or attract capital to pay for it. That's also inevitable. No matter how successful we are with indigenization, this is something that economic history tells us is inevitable. And therefore, currency depreciation that we are witnessing today isn't something unique to India. Countries which have a current account deficit have seen their currencies depreciate. If you look at the performance of currencies since the millennium began, the Indian rupee actually has done quite well. And the performance even since COVID, India is in the same ballpark, not an outlier. So we need to get the breathless headlines about the Indian rupee into perspective. Therefore, at the same time, since we have aspirations to become a major global player, and naturally currency strength and stability is associated with economic rise. But how do we get there? And that is where this survey focuses on, saying that manufacturing strength is a precondition for achieving currency stability and strength. A strong growth in manufacturing exports leads to improved current accounts position, leads to forex reserve accumulation, and therefore gradual strengthening of currency credibility. If you look at today's countries,
ஏற்கனவே நடத்தப்பட்ட கருத்து கணிப்புல திமுக தான் மீண்டும் ஜெயிக்குங்கிற மாதிரி தகவல்லாம் வந்தது. இன்னைக்கு உங்க கூட்டணி பலமாயிடுச்சு அப்படிங்கிற மாதிரி ஒரு பேச்சு இருக்கக்கூடிய சூழல்ல எப்படி இருக்கு வெற்றி வாய்ப்பு?
தயவு செய்து பத்திரிகை ஊடகம் இல்லாம நல்ல செய்தி போடுங்க. நீங்க போட்டீங்களா போ, நாங்க ஜெயிச்சிருவோம். நீங்க ஒண்ணுமே செய்யாத அரசாங்கத்தை தூக்கி பிடிச்சிட்டு இருக்கிறீங்க. உண்மை செய்தி போட்டீங்களா போது நாங்கள் வெற்றி பெற்றுவோம். நாங்கள் ஒன்றும் எங்களுக்கு கூடுதலான செய்தி போடணும்னு சொல்லவே இல்லை. உண்மை செய்தியை, நாட்டில் நிலவுகின்ற பிரச்சனையை அதை உண்மையாக வெளியிட்டீங்களாவே அதிமுக 100% வெற்றி பெற்று ஆட்சி. நாங்கள் ஒன்றும் எங்களுக்கு அவர்கள் மாதிரி போஸ்ட் பண்ணி போடணும்னு எங்களுக்கு அவசியம் இல்லை. நாங்கள் திறமையாக ஆட்சி செஞ்சோம், மக்களிடத்தில் நல்ல பேர் இருக்குது. இன்றைக்கி திமுக ஆட்சி வந்த பிறகு ஒரு ஊழல் நிறைந்த அரசாங்கமாக மக்களுடைய பார்வைக்கு போயிடுது. எல்லா வகையிலும் இந்த அரசு தோல்விவிட்டது. எந்த திட்டத்தையும் நிறைவேற்றலை. உதாரணத்துக்கு சேலம் மாவட்டத்தில் எந்த திட்டத்தை கூட நிறைவேற்றல. உங்களுக்கே தெரியும், அதிமுக ஆட்சி இருக்கும்போது எத்தனை திட்டத்தை நிறைவேற்றி கொடுத்தோம். கம்பேர் பண்ணுங்கள். அதிமுக ஆட்சியில் எப்படி இருந்தது, திமுக ஆட்சியில் எப்படி இருந்தது, அதுதான் மக்கள் கம்பேர் பண்ண ஆரம்பிச்சிட்டாங்க. தேர்தல் நெருங்க அதிமுக வெற்றி பிரகாசமாக இருந்துட்டு இருக்கு. வந்துடுது, விரசல் வந்துடுது. தினந்தோறும் நீங்கள் தானே போட்டுட்டு இருக்கீங்க, ஊடகத்திலையும் பத்திரிகையிலையும். நேற்றைய தினம் கூட திரு கனிமொழி அவர்கள் போகிறாங்க. அங்கே போய் என்ன பண்ணுறாங்க, ராகுல் காந்தி சந்திக்கிறாங்க. ராகுல் காந்தி சந்தித்த பிறகு இதுக்காக சந்திக்கிறாங்க, எங்களை தான் சொன்னாங்க. எடப்பாடி பழனிசாமி டெல்லிக்கு அடிமைனாங்க. யார் அடிமை? நாங்கள் அடிமை இல்லை, திராவிட முன்னேற்ற கழகம் தான் அடிமை. இன்றைக்கி அங்கே போய் கெஞ்சிக்கின்ற நிலவிக்கு வந்துடுது திமுக. இங்கிருந்து அங்கே போய்